tonight. It is a great honor to gather with our dear colleagues to focus on a modern-day conflict that will have major implications for this country and the world in the days and years to come. The United States, for over a century, since our hard-fought victories with allies during World Wars I and II, learned the hard way isolation is not our nation's security interest. Isolation is not in our nation's security interest. Our nation is not the most populous nation on earth, with 340 million people. But in every era, it seems, a constellation of dictatorships begins to upset world order. These aggressors invade smaller nations first to conquer more territory and for their own narrow self-interest. Dictatorships in today's world include Russia, with 140 million people, China, with 1.5 billion people, Iran, with 92 million people, and North Korea, with 26 million people. This group of nations is a developing spiderweb of tyranny with 4 times the population of the United States. Thus, alliances with free nations matter. That is why Canada, Australia, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations matter. Only together with allies can the free world offset predatory dictatorships. Following World War I, slowly and at great cost, a constellation of allies began to emerge. Leaders of surviving nations created what has come to be called the free world. But this alliance of liberty was very hard fought, and it champions freedom, not dictatorship. Foundational is a rule of law with institutions of justice, ensuring individual rights, not repression by dictators or conquest by aggressors, thugs, and murderers. Our nation did not seek to be leader of the free world. Rather, our forebears grew this association with the realization that cataclysmic wars were not in the interests of humanity, nor the United States of America. President Woodrow Wilson created the League of Nations after World War I, which 3 decades later transformed into the United Nations, an institution to collectively assemble world leaders to promote understanding and peace so as to avoid war. Civil and political leaders of our nation in both major political parties, though reluctant to assume leadership in such a daunting undertaking, never before in the world, were determined to build a world of law, not conquest. The goal of lasting peace outweighed their own self-interest. A short distance away from our nation's capital rests the National World War II Memorial. It was dedicated in 2004 to the Allied victory in World War II. Over 100 million people, nearly 1/3 of our population, has now visited that hallowed site. This monument represents the 20th century's greatest achievement, the victory of liberty over tyranny. The monument stands as a timeless reminder of the moral strength and power that can flow when free people are united and bond together in the common, just cause of liberty itself. Following the horrific great power wars of the 20th century, across Europe alone are laid the bodies of 500,000 U.S. veterans who rest in military cemeteries and fields from World Wars I and II. From Flanders Field to Normandy, their enormous sacrifice, along with the millions of veterans who returned home, bequeathed to us the moment to build the umbrella of alliances to push back tyranny, extending liberty and achieving democratic governance peacefully served as examples to other nations. What the World War I and II generations yielded for us has been the longest era of peacetime among great powers in the history of the world until now. Not only is Russia at war in Europe, but the United States of America is acting peculiarly and dangerously out of step with our forebears' resolve. Let me just for a moment focus on Vladimir Putin and his evil aspirations as dictator of Russia. Let us recall Putin's imperative is to reconstitute the Soviet Union that collapsed in 1991 of its own criminality and dysfunction. Its border extended across 13 time zones then, all the way through most of Germany. Through force, Putin aspires to rewrite the structure of Europe again and end democratic practice across the continent. Meanwhile, the United States appears absent. Liberty is under threat, and America seems to be wavering on the sidelines, playing off liberty and dictatorship. The increasingly collaborative coalition of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, the spiderweb of modern tyranny, are enemies of liberty. See it? They collude to upend American and global security. Chancellor Merz of Germany, a NATO ally, recognized this reality when he recently stated, and I quote, "The threats are real. We may not be at war, but we no longer live in peacetime," unquote. Ukraine has become the front line for liberty's fight in our time and generation. See it. In 2014, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, an ally of the United States. Together with our European allies, we partnered to achieve Ukraine's accession to the European Union of Free Nations, and clearly Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014, just after Russia's puppet dictator, who had become president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was driven out of that nation after his treasonous betrayal of the democratic aspirations of the free people of Ukraine. He stole millions and committed crimes against its freedom, and he found his way back to Moscow. Vladimir Putin knew his control of that puppet and of Ukraine had been thwarted, so he chose to invade Ukraine in 2014, starting in 2014, against all laws of diplomacy. Putin snuffed out liberty in his own country, and now he intends not just to end liberty in all of Europe, he seeks to replace it with tyranny that traces its bloody lineage across centuries of Russian aggression and murder of innocents. There can be no compromise with Putin. He violated the Budapest Memorandum, which allowed Ukraine to prosper starting in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union, when it promised to let all nuclear weapons be removed from Ukraine with the promise that they would not be invaded, that others would protect them. Russia signed that agreement. The United States signed that agreement. That agreement has been violated. Why should we trust Putin now when he couldn't even keep his word on the Budapest Memorandum? Let us not forget that the great betrayal that allowed Putin to invade Ukraine in the first place. As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a newly independent Ukraine had become the third largest nuclear power in the world. However, as a responsible nation, Ukraine signed the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty at the behest of the United States of America and the demand of Russia. In exchange for this security, Ukraine was to be guaranteed under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, signed by our country, Russia, and Ukraine, However, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 after his puppet was driven out. Russia always betrays its commitments. Look no further than the decades before when the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement during World War II was signed and then violated, and Poland was invaded. We must not betray our commitment as leader of the free world to Ukraine's liberty. Ukraine is fighting valiantly against Russia. It is holding the line at the front. The Ukrainian people have fought so astoundingly until the current president and his party here in Congress decided not to send the funds to allow Ukraine to procure the weapons it needs. So there have been a pause during this year, which makes it harder, but the Ukrainians have held the front. Ukraine has one time zone and encompasses a landmass less than 3% the size of Russia's vast territory, which stretches across, are you ready, 11 time zones. They have enough. They ought to deal in their own country. Russia's population equals 4 times as many people as Ukraine's. Putin was the aggressor. He invaded, as I said, in 2014, and he has kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. Why? Because in Russia, the birth rate is going down. And so by murdering tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and reinstituting the Gulag system of prisons to torture Ukrainians, he's attacked religious communities and buildings, broken families apart, murdered and tortured scores and hundreds of clergy, killed Jehovah's Witnesses and any other religion that attempts to prosper in that part of the world, and summarily executed prisoners of war and civilians alike. This is what Putin promises the rest of Ukraine and our NATO allies should we let him succeed in Ukraine. See it. See it for what it is. Russia's history is marked by repressive expansion and murder throughout the centuries. There is no liberty nor desire for any liberty. Russia kills at will. Freedom advocate Alexei Navalny, a Russian, was imprisoned last year and left to die in a frozen Arctic prison. Putin's goons murdered a young Ukrainian journalist almost 30 years ago when Ukraine became free. Why? Because Gangadze was telling the truth about the corruption and the underhandedness of Russia inside of the free Ukraine. He was killed and then buried with his head in the ground and his legs in the air right before people would enter the town of Lviv, just to be a lesson to behave yourself. And don't ever put a word in a publication against Vladimir Putin. Putin murdered countless Catholics, Mormons, others who wanted to freely practice their religion in that part of the world. And why were they murdered? Because they weren't Russian Orthodox adherents. If Putin is permitted to conquer Ukraine, he will not stop there. This is not speculation. This is history. We already see Russian troops concentrated at the borders with Baltic states. They're hitting the fly zone in Poland, the border, Finland, Russian violations of NATO airspace and territorial waters. A Polish diplomat once advised me, if you pay no attention to foreign affairs, then foreign affairs will find you. What a true statement that is. Surely the Poles know. America has tried in the past to stick its head in the sand. That doesn't work. Isolation doesn't work. Partnership works. America can repeat the mistakes of the 1920s by withdrawing our support. But we've already lived through that. We don't want to go through that again. Inevitably, that myopia will force the free world to pay a higher price for freedom as tyranny deepens its roots in the world. Or America can take a stand now to provide further assistance for Ukraine to advance liberty for this new generation. And remember, only 20% of the world is free now, according to Freedom's House and Freedom's Index. This means that 80% of the world lives under some some form of tyranny. We are very privileged in our country if we can hold it. In our privileged place in the world, America cannot forget that around our globe and throughout history, liberty is extremely rare and precious and utterly vulnerable. The Trump administration is failing to meet the moment. My dear colleagues, we'll talk about this in just a moment, but what this administration is doing is just not ignoring the problem. They are actively complicit in tyranny's march across Europe. This administration's new and adolescent national security manifesto, they call it, is a retreat. During his campaign, President Trump frequently repeated that he will end the war in Ukraine on day one. Well, that surely didn't happen. And yet 1 year into his return to office, the war in Ukraine rages on, and his actions have been favoring Russia's dictatorship. In February and March, President Trump made his first real effort to negotiate. But what is he negotiating? Not liberty, but Ukraine's President Zelensky came to the table and agreed to President Trump's mineral rights deal. Trump responded to Russia's growing strikes, but granted Putin with several weeks' warning to end the shooting or face new sanctions. He did not implement the sanctions, even as Ukrainians were being murdered every day. In August, President Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for dictator Putin to step foot in the land of the free during his visit to Anchorage, Alaska. Putin conceded nothing then, he concedes nothing now. Trump whined at Putin and again threatened sanctions. Finally, in October, the president did sanction two large Russian oil firms, Lukoil and Rosneft, but then reinvigorated a negotiating process with several decidedly Kremlin-friendly provisions, even as Putin showed no signs of compromise. Now, 4 months later, we are waiting on the Trump administration or Republicans in Congress to move additional sanctions. And up at the desk, we have only on a discharge petition to move a bill to enforce sanctions on Russia. We only need 2 more signatures to get to 218. 218. Where is the majority in this House? 2 more signatures on the discharge petition to move Russian sanctions forward. Liberty is calling. Can you see it? Can you hear it? This October, the Trump administration started issuing Russia's threats to Ukraine for Putin. The Russian-drafted 28-point peace plan asked Ukraine not to negotiate peace, but to capitulate. They cited a recent corruption scandal in Ukraine, not for what it is, Russian interference and corruption in Ukraine through their emissaries, but as evidence that Ukraine is weak and must surrender. This is Russian infiltration of Ukrainian institutions that has been going on for centuries and has plagued Ukraine from the first day it became free in 1991. Ukraine has had to build a nation on the corruption and infiltration of the corrupt, calculating, interfering Russian regime. Then just last week, the Trump administration stood shoulder to shoulder with the Russian dictatorship. Never in my life did I imagine I would live to see the day when the United States of America, as a founding member of NATO and the United Nations, would vote with the dictatorships of the world. This happened on December 10th, this month, 2025, when the United States joined the dictatorships of Russia, Belarus, China, North Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Niger in a 97-8 vote to oppose a United Nations resolution that aimed to strengthen international cooperation and coordination of efforts among nations. This shameful vote of 97-8 does not express the values of the United States of America. It does not express the values of the American people who place liberty above all. We value our closest allies, especially when Europe is at war. You don't side with the dictators. The Trump administration publicly holds that the ultimate goal is peace. I agree. Everyone wants peace except Putin. Do you not see it? Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Ukraine. Putin does not want peace. He wants Ukraine. The Ukrainians prove to us every day liberty is worth fighting for. We best not forget that here in America. Frankly, I haven't found anyone in the Trump family who has ever fought for the cause of liberty. There is no record of military service or public service in his family's history. In fact, Trump famously avoided service in Vietnam by faking bone spurs. No one in my family ever had that luxury. They fought for over 100 years for this country, and we are proud of their service for liberty. What seems clear to me is that too many people like Putin judge others by the weight of their wallet rather than the weight of their conviction for liberty. As peace negotiations ensue this weekend in Miami, let us pray the negotiation is not about squeezing every business deal out of Ukraine for the Trump organization. That outcome is not in America's interest. Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, two former real estate businessmen from New York, should negotiate peace and liberty, not business deals for themselves or the president they serve, business deals of a Russian-occupied Ukraine. The free world must push back Russia's aggression and greed, or Putin's appetite will grow to spread Russian repression across all free peoples, which he has been trying to do since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Our late colleague John Lewis observed, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It does not sit on the floor, but must be elevated by the steady diligence and attention of citizens who sacrifice to remain free. Liberty is not simply bestowed upon a people, but fought for and defended." History instructs us. In the 1770s and 80s, a revolutionary generation of men and women rose up to secure liberty across 13 otherwise disconnected coastal colonies here on the American continent. Roughly 80 years later, a subsequent generation was called upon to fight and die in America's internal Great War for liberty, the American Civil War, still our most costly war, with over 600,000 deaths. That generation ended the original sin of slavery and extended the hope of liberty across the American continent. And then in the 20th century, generations rose to the renewed call for sacrifice. Called the greatest generation, I call them the most unselfish generation. They fought, died, and successfully preserved and extended liberty here at home and to subjugated people around the world. They did it for us. Americans believe that the history of their struggle against global tyranny ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the fall of the communist Soviet Union, yet today that history is still being written. Free nations face not a new enemy, but an old one. It is our turn now. Our free world must never play footsie with an axis of dictatorships like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China to unleash their aggression on our world again. How not only stupid that would be, but how un-American. America's foreign policy must promote liberty, not bow to tyranny. Free nations must support those who are willing to fight and die for liberty around our world. And Congress must assure our nation is always ready. Our National Defense Authorization Act just passed, providing for military readiness for our nation as well as assistance to Ukraine to assure NATO's eastern flank is secure and Vladimir Putin moves back his troops inside his own country. He has plenty of it he needs to attend to. Congress can do more by passing a discharge petition that has been sitting in the well of this House since July. It would unlock the most significant legislation introduced in this Congress to place economic sanctions on Russia for its war crimes against Ukraine. And our petition only needs 2 more members' signatures to bring forward the vote to the floor. Every Democrat and 2 Republicans have signed thus far. In closing my formal remarks tonight, I would like to quote the poet laureate of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko. In our country, we must defend liberty first, last, and always, and it must never accommodate dictatorships. And we are reminded of this by this astounding visionary poet of Ukraine, who on Christmas, December 25th, 1845, penned the following words about a country that at that point was only imagining through its greatest citizens a future that they could not live in their own lifetime. And he said, "O bury me, then rise ye up, and break your heavy chains, and water with the tyrant's blood the freedom you have gained. And in the great new family, the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly word, remember also me." He was so prescient. He was so prescient. I would like now to turn the podium over to the Speaker Emerita of the House of Representatives from the great state of California, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi.